This is a series in which each month we'll have a conversation about a contemporary book that helps us grapple with the nature of life on Earth, where we might be headed in this time of immense ecological challenges, and how we might respond. We'll also consider 3 older books that we're thinking of as landmark texts, and today we'll begin with one of those, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring.
The situation that prompts the book, that gets the book rolling, is one in which, through an attempt to control pests, especially insects in the US, you have the very widespread use, especially through sprays, of quite toxic new chemicals. They're just being sprayed from planes, not just on crops, but on whole communities. Whole big swathes of the countryside are being covered in what turned out to be very poorly understood chemicals, with the amounts chosen often quite capriciously. So there's a kind of rain of powders and solutions coming down on plants and animals, on the environment, on people in their houses. And what Carson came to think of as, a completely irresponsible attitude to the potential dangers of this. So she wrote about some of the worst of the chemicals that were being used in this way, some of the most harmful and unsuccessful projects of eradication. DDT is still surrounded by some controversies. It still has its defenders. And when I read the book, as I read the book, it's not just or even especially the case of DDT that is the disturbing one. There's a long list of more toxic chemicals that Carson writes about that are being used in these irresponsible ways. These are chemicals that are killing very quickly farmhands who get too heavy an exposure to them. They're landing on ponds, in forests. They're wiping out small birds. There's a real kind of there's carnage that she's seeing, and that prompts Silent Spring. One of the powerful features of the book, to my mind, is her emphasis on the way that chemicals, which might initially be spread around in small amounts, get concentrated as a consequence of the nature of food chains and food webs, situations where you have a sort of cascading relationship with respect to who eats who. And sometimes, as a consequence of these relationships, the organisms who are a fair way up the chain, often birds in her examples, wind up with really large amounts, really toxic amounts of chemicals that were spread around in small proportions earlier on. In some of the passages that perhaps some readers may have been surprised by, given the popularity of this book, she walks through the chemistry in quite a bit of detail of these synthetic carbon-based, very complex molecules that were being created for the first time in the years after World War II. Because she's a scientist, she has a good understanding of why it is that these molecules were different from anything else, what kind of new features they had. This is something also I think we'll encounter when we look at James Lovelock in a later episode and his Gaia book. There are some people like Carson and Lovelock whose knowledge of what can often be a rather dull-looking part of science is so deep that they can give you an appreciation of the specialness of what certain kinds of chemicals can do. When you read that part of Carson, when I read this part of Carson, I got a sense of how the chemical companies might have found it endlessly fascinating to just build compound after compound, new molecule after new molecule. These are efficacious, novel chemicals. And when they turn out to apparently kill insects and leave crops undamaged, then the kind of overconfidence and hubris will lead to them being, as you say, used indiscriminately.
Which I think gets to one of the sort of deepest stylistic choices that she makes here, which is to link radiation and chemicals. Because at the time, nuclear weapons were the most terrifying thing you could think of. They were the biggest existential threat to life. And she, from the very beginning of the book, links radiation as a threat to human existence with these chemicals. I'll just read very quickly from, this is the very beginning of chapter 2, which is right after that little fable that she tells about the town. Only within the moment of time represented by the present century has one species, man, acquired significant power to alter the nature of his world. During the past quarter century, this power has not only increased to one of disturbing magnitude, but it has changed in character. The most alarming of all man's assaults upon the environment is the contamination of air, earth, rivers, and sea with dangerous and even lethal materials. This pollution is for the most part irrecoverable. The chain of evil it initiates not only in the world that must support life, but in living tissues is for the most part irreversible. In this now universal contamination of the environment, chemicals are the sinister and little recognized partners of radiation in changing the very nature of the world, the very nature of its life. She goes on in later chapters to show how radiation can affect cellular machinery in this very particular way. And then she shows that that same effect is what these chemicals can do. So at the very core of the way that cells produce energy that powers all of life, what radiation does, she calls it this wheel. There's this wheel she described, and radiation goes in there and sort of puts a spoke in the wheel and makes it stop turning. And these chemicals do the same thing to this same little wheel inside this piece of cellular machinery. And throughout, she uses that. It's not even a metaphor. It's like the existential threat of the chemical and the radiation and the ways that humans are changing our environment. And we are now capable of altering the web of life and potentially destroying it.
I'm cautious about the wheel passage.
Okay.
She's writing in the early 60s, and she's very prescient about the interlocking of various parts of biology. I couldn't tell whether what she was describing there is, she's saying how she thinks things work. I couldn't tell whether what she was describing there fits in well with what we think is going on now. It was a compelling picture. I don't know how accurate that part of the book was.
And this is part of, again, what is incredible about this book is her capacity for inference, right? She is looking at the very edge of what all of these various scientific disciplines know, and she's connecting them and saying, well, if this is true in birds, then I think it's probably true in humans, right? Or if it's true in these kinds of cells, it's probably true in these other kinds of cells. And so she's building arguments that are, to some degree, not entirely testable because the science hasn't caught up with her reasoning, which is kind of incredible because in many cases, it turns out she was right. Right. One of the things about the link between chemicals and cancer was not known until she sort of intuited it out of various kinds of studies.
Is that right? I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So Carson was able to document these links between pesticide exposures and cancer risk, even though she's working without any kind of state-based cancer registries. She's working without a working model of endocrine disruption or epigenetics, and both of these elucidate how toxic chemicals can actually alter DNA activity, even when there's no other mutation or other kind of genetic injury. But she doesn't have any of the science to back that up. She's working without all of these tools. It's not yet accepted that the timing of exposure matters, for example, with exposures during pregnancy, infancy, and early childhood mattering more than later exposures in life. She didn't have geographic information, computer mapping programs that are giving these kind of, visually compelling pictures of cancer clusters or other kinds of patterns that can be used for statistical analysis. And yet she was able to map out the early signs of a cancer epidemic in the U.S. that she was able to link to the toxicity of these chemicals. And she was especially concerned about early life exposures with children and pregnant women, and she was right.
That is remarkable. As you were going through that sort of stage setting, I was reminded of the fact that if she's writing this in the very early 60s, even the most basic knowledge we have of gene regulation was contemporary with that, roughly
Yes.
1960, before. It was not background knowledge. She,
Right.
in thinking about the regulation of gene action She wasn't in the dark, but she was pushing ahead. That's true.
And that's part of why I think this text in particular, as a text of science writing and sort of showing what science writing can do, there's sometimes an idea among scientists, that the writers of science are there just to sort of take your results and report them to the world. And she's making something else out of them. She's making literature and poetry out of them. And she's also making science out of them, which is it's an incredible achievement.
It is.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. Go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.